There are harmful things that we think, do, and say that harm others. There are things that we need to learn and unlearn. Welcome to Homeschool Yourself. I'm Delina Price McFall. In this episode, I get to talk to one of the people that I've learned from in the past few years. Her name is Kelly Tudor, and she's dedicated her career to undoing the harm that has been done to Indigenous people in this country. She does this through education. She teaches children and she teaches adults. Also, she teaches teachers and she does curriculum development. There's so many untrue things that we all learned in school about Native American people. We learned stereotypes as truth. Most of the time, we didn't have anyone to guide us to even be able to spot the stereotypes and think about the harm that was done by certain messages that we learned. Many times, just by not learning their history, who they are, and them not being even in our consciousness, we learn to ignore them in the present day and ignore their contributions. About 10 years ago, a book came out called Waking Up White by Debbie Irving. I read it because I was leading a group where we unpacked issues of race. I really think this is a really powerful book. And one of the things that I loved about it is that after every essay or chapter, there would be thought-provoking questions to help you unpack your own thoughts. And one of the questions, and you can find this on page 91 of the book, and I'll link to the book in the show notes. One of the questions asks you to make columns and label them, and next to each, quickly write 5 stereotypes that come to mind for each group of people. So they have African American, white, Asian American, Native American, and so on. I was honestly surprised about what I wrote down. It got me thinking, where did I learn this from? Where did I get this? Where did I get all of this misinformation? In this episode, Kelly and I talk about exactly where these harmful ideas come from. Take a listen. So this is exciting. Kelly, will you give us your real robust introduction about who you are and what you do, and tell us about Kelly?
Danjo, Kelly Shiitle Pa Inde. Hello, my name is Kelly, and I'm Lippon Apache. I'm a citizen of the Lippon Apache tribe of Texas. I am an educator, and I homeschool my own children. I am, culturally intact and raising my children traditionally Lippon.
What does that even mean? That you're culturally intact?
A lot of times when I meet people and people are like, oh, you're Native American, you're Indian or whatever, yeah, I'm, Lippon Apache and that kind of thing. There's not a lot of understanding of what that means. I've tried to explain, we are culturally different than North American people. Like we have our own cultures. And then people are like, what do you mean your own culture? Like what foods and values and traditions and all these different things, and people, well, what do you mean it's different than the United States, or what is, and so I like to say that I'm culturally intact because it indicates that I'm not just somebody that has some like distant, oh, my great grandmother was, whatever, which is really common. A lot of people do have some distant Native heritage, or at least families of that, or stories of that in their families, which may or may not be true, but that's not the same
another
thing.
Story for another day.
Yeah, but that's not the same thing as actually being an Indigenous person and having a Native identity. And so I like to say, I'm a Native person, I'm Lippon Apache, but I'm also culturally intact because I do have my culture, my traditional culture. I am Lippon all day, every day, and how I live and how I see the world and how I experience the world. And our cultural traditions are a part of our life. And so it's not just something that's distant heritage in my family. It's not just something that I know a little bit about, but it's my daily existence.
Okay. This is not something that you came to know later in life. This is how you grew up.
Right. Yeah. I was raised Lippon, and my kids are raised Lippon. I didn't find out later that I had like a Native ancestor and then wanted to know more about it. People sometimes ask me, well, how can I find out about my family, tree, blah, blah, blah. And I don't know anything about genealogy. I've never had to do that. I fortunately have always been connected to my nation, my culture, my people. And I know for a lot of Native people, that's not always the case because of history, the way it's happened. And a lot of Native people find out later, or they know they're Native their whole life, but they don't have that connection because of a variety of reasons in history. And so I understand that that's a very fortunate thing as a Native person, to be able to have that connection that I've always had. But it is a bit different than just having some distant ancestry or heritage that I know a little bit about.
Right. Great. So how did you come to want to educate others about Native people?
So as an Indigenous person, I'm constantly having to correct misconceptions about us pretty much everywhere I go. Everybody I talk to, there's always something that comes up in that. Or people are curious and want to know more. So I just end up having to tell about myself and teach and educate. So for a lot of Native people, it's not really a choice, just because there's so much undereducation and miseducation about us out there that a lot of us don't really have an option. Like, that's just kind of what we have to do in social interactions. So I grew up in public education, and I remember how harmful it was. And then when I started homeschooling my kids from the beginning, I started noticing like how horrible the options were for curriculum. Like, there was nothing out there, and everything was just really whitewashed, racist, full of stereotypes and misinformation. I wasn't surprised, because that's the kind of stuff that I was taught. And I didn't really expect at the time, homeschool curriculum to be a whole lot different than what's in the public schools. And but I was frustrated by it. So I started just making my own stuff and using good materials that I knew about. And then people started asking me for recommendations. And then I started writing lessons and curriculum and lesson plans and things. And people started asking me for more. And so it just kind of grew kind of organically out of being a homeschooler. And then my Auntie Teresa, she was a storyteller, and she was hired at a historic site every year for a week-long educational event. And she told them to hire me and my kids to teach about dance, because they needed somebody. They had an empty spot. And so they did. And I was like, all right. So we got on contract with them, and every year we started teaching with them at their event. And then we started getting hired at museums and schools and libraries, and the teachers were always coming up and asking me questions and complimenting us. And so then they started asking me for resources. So I started compiling resources for teachers and making book lists. And then I started making alternative lists to popular curricula. And I kind of got famous in the homeschool world, and just kind of branched out from there. So it was all really organic and kind of accidental. But I now teach on OutSchool. And then I'm also hired to train teachers in different school districts and educators. And then I run seminars and workshops for teachers and educators for identifying Native stereotypes in materials and how to find better materials. I get hired at schools and museums and libraries still. And then I'm also a consultant for multiple curriculum companies, like with you and several others. And then I'm also right now on a committee to develop a high school Native Studies curriculum for the entire state of Texas, that we're hopefully going to be launching this fall.
That's wow. So I was interested that you said you grew up in the public school system. So, I mean, this is not in our line of questioning here, but what was that like?
It was rough. My sister and I were the only Native students in our school, and we got in trouble a lot because we would challenge the teachers. And, I remember there was a time where my sister had challenged one of the teachers, and the teacher said, well, where did you learn that? And she said, well, my dad, because we're Apache. And she said, well, your dad is stupid. And so that's how teachers treated us, especially when we would challenge them about the things they were teaching. And that eventually led to some silencing, of course, and we didn't really get to deal with that on a higher level at all, because we were just kids. And then we dealt with a lot of racial bullying and racial slurs in schools, and just issues like that from students and teachers. It wasn't just a students thing, it was all around. And then of course the educational materials, the things that are taught in public schools, are just wrong, stereotypes, sometimes racist. just not good, especially growing up, in the 80s and 90s, right? So it was a bit different then too. So it was rough, and it definitely gave me a lot of resolve by the time I was an adolescent to fight back against that and push against those narratives. I was an activist from an early age, and I guess that gave me a lot of reason to fight, a lot of reason to
Yeah.
against that, and in the education world specifically, because I had those experiences and I remember that.
Did that inform your reason for homeschooling?
Part of it, yes. We have a lot of reasons for homeschooling, but that's one of them. Yeah, I didn't want my kids in that education system, and hearing those things being taught about us, and them being told all these wrong things, and there's only so many hours in a day when they're at school all day, how much you can correct at home. And of course they'd be raised, they're being raised culturally, so that would still definitely shape how they process that information from schools, but still a lot of the facts of history and things can't be corrected as much. And so
and just the environment. I mean, I haven't thought this through, but I'm just gonna say it anyway. I feel like we know the things that you shouldn't say about Black people in school. We don't know those things. Well, like, there's not years and years of this. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't get said, but I'm saying, do you see what I'm saying? Like, up until last year, there was still a football team named a racial slur.
A national team, yeah, and there still are all over the country. That the racial slur is still used for teams all over the country in schools. So
right. So so there's like a different consciousness.
There really is. We're still invisible. We still don't exist in the public consciousness. We're still some mythological thing of the past.
And one thing, not different nations.
Right. Like, we're all lumped together into one people group. Either that, or if people do recognize our modern existence, we're a bunch of lazy drunks, or we're doing nothing. Right. We don't contribute anything. We do nothing. And so the public awareness of our not only existence, but just who we are is non-existent. And so, yeah, schools don't have that, like, we know what to say and what not to say, and that kind of thing. Right. And then when you try to go up against these things at schools, like the mascot issue, or even just what they're teaching and how they're teaching it, or even how Native students are treated. There's a current issue a lot. The schools violate the American Indian Religious Freedom Act all the time at graduations, when they tell students they can't have their eagle feathers or their the beaded caps or their cultural expressions at graduations, right? And they'll come up, and there's been teachers that'll throw eagle feathers on the ground, which is like culturally, like,
offensive,
terrible. It's a terrible thing. You don't let those touch the ground, right? And so and that's a violation of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which wasn't passed until 1978. And so we've only had religious freedom since 78. But schools all over the country won't let Native students have those cultural expressions, which they're legally allowed to have by federal law. And teachers and administrators are completely ignorant of that federal law and don't even know about it. Or even here in Texas, and in other places too, but here in Texas, it's happened several times where Native students will go to school. Boys with long hair will be told they have to cut their hair because the dress code says boys' hair has to be cut up here. And well, this is cultural, this is religious, and here in Texas, we had a kid from actually the Lippon Apache tribe of Texas, from my nation, Adriel Arocha, who was in kindergarten, was put in in-school suspension for wearing long hair and not cutting it. And they made us tuck his braid down the back of his shirt, which was very uncomfortable, and wouldn't let him be around other kids. And he took them all the way to, I think it was the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, and won. And now there's actually case law in Texas that every time Texas schools try to tell Native students they have to cut their hair, you can just pull out that case law and they have to stop. And that still happens. Like, I know a family was posting about it just a few months ago here in Texas, I think at the beginning of the school year. And so those kinds of issues, most people just don't even know that there are cultural and religious protections for this, and that these are actual cultural and religious expressions,
right.
let alone it's not just like some kind of fun decoration or
Yeah.
whatever on your
Not a
graduation.
fad, right?
Right. And so there's all that complete ignorance and uneducation, miseducation about those things that even school administrators and teachers don't realize.
Wow. Yeah. So where do you start? You start with the children, or you start with the school administrators to teach? That's just a rhetorical question.
I find that elementary kids tend to be the most accepting and most willing to change how they think when given new information. The older the students get, the harder it is to challenge those narratives that they've been taught. And then, especially adults are a lot harder to reach. There's a lot of unlearning to do, and a lot of adults don't like to confront that in themselves. And so there's a lot of pushback and a lot of rejection of it. When I train teachers, there's a lot of confusion, a lot of, they don't want to recognize that they've unintentionally been doing harm through the way they're educating.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not their fault. They were taught that way, and that they were taught to teach that way. But they don't want to usually face that. And so I find it a lot easier to reach the younger kids, either starting from the beginning or, in elementary school, if they've been taught some of those false narratives, to be able to address it early on. And they're like, oh, wait a minute, that's not what I was told. And then they want more, and they want to know more, and then they want to tell others. And they're a lot more accepting of it and a lot more willing to confront that. Mm-hmm. So the older they get, and the more those false narratives are ingrained in their minds, and those stereotypes that they're confronted with about us all the time, the harder it is to reach them.
Right. So, okay, I know this is probably not a fair question, but what are the top 3 terrible things that we've learned about Native people or Native history?
So, I don't know. I can't really choose 3. That racism and stereotypes are okay when it's Native people.
Oh.
That's not just with mascots, but with the educational materials too. That's really ingrained in education from the very beginning. These ideas that we don't exist anymore. 87%
probably go together, right?
Right. 87% of textbooks don't mention us past 1900. And so this isn't explicitly taught. Like, teachers don't stand up there and say Native Americans don't exist anymore, but it's implied. Mm-hmm. And then that means people don't learn all of the issues that we deal with in the 20th and 21st century.
Right.
So all the things that we're continuing, all 10 definitions of, or all 10 stages of genocide were still occurring to Native peoples through the 20th century. And several of them are still occurring now. Right. And so, but this isn't taught because we don't exist anymore. Right. We're right. Pre-1900. Right. And then I think a final major issue is that we were, I say the S word, savages. It's a racial slur. But we were just as bad to each other as the Europeans were to us. So whatever the Europeans did, it's not a big deal. I see this all the time, especially online on social media. When Native news stories come up, there's going to be commenters, well, they were just as bad to each other as we were to them, and they were just killing each other before we showed up. And that's not true at all. But that's the narrative that's pushed. So it's a really major issue when it comes to confronting modern issues that Native people are coming up against. That's the pushback that we receive from the public.
Yeah. I didn't know the S word was a racial slur. Is it the word? I'm not saying it. I didn't know that you shouldn't say that about Native people. I'm saying the word in general.
I mean, when used, not for people.
Okay.
If you're going to talk about, like, I don't like the word in any context, but there's contexts where it's not about people and it's not a slur. But when it's referring to Native people or people in general, really it is. And it's definitely been one that's been used against us.
Right. And Indigenous people from all over the world, that's been used.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't even think of what other context we know that word. That's how we know that word.
I think a lot of youth are using it as slang these days for, like, something being like what we used to call, like, killer or sick, They'll use it that way. So I think that's kind of coming around as a slang term now, but
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think you answered this question about resources for homeschooling, but how do you teach your kids about hard history, and not history that's abstract, or, it's history about our people. It's history about us. This is directly related to our present. So
mhm.
how do you navigate that?
It can be tough. My kids have grown up with strong ties to our nation and their culture. They've been raised with cultural understandings and worldviews that are quite different than the United States. And so they recognize a lot of things in the dominant culture around them that are very different than how we see things and how we experience things. And they already see that on their own because of the way they've been raised. So when it comes to hard history, they already have that Indigenous lens and perspective on things. When they see history, they already have that in the first place. So it's easier to recognize and easier to confront, I think. But at the same time, when it's our own people and our own histories, it's hard. When people learn about like the Indian boarding schools, which is in the news right now because of Canada, but that happened here in the United States too.
Oh, it's coming. And that story's coming.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're going to start uncovering the same things here because Deb Haaland just called for an inquiry into the Indian boarding schools here. So, but when people learn about that, because that's not taught in schools, that's 20th century and we don't exist anymore, right? So that doesn't get taught. But when people learn about that, they're shocked and wow, and it's hard, and it is hard history to confront. But like when my kids learned about that, they cry. When we watched there's a scene in the series Into the West about the boarding schools, about the kids being taken away, and my kids bawled and we had to turn it off and talk. Because that's their own people. That's us. That's what our families experienced. And so
you feel it differently.
It can be really hard to face sometimes, especially for young kids, seeing those kinds of histories, knowing my kids watch that and learn about that and know that could have been them. I watch those interviews from survivors and realize that could have been me, because compulsory attendance for Indian boarding schools was not ended until 1978, and I was only born a few years after that. And so it's hard. And then looking at my own children and thinking about like that could have been me and them experiencing, and it's so the kids, they experience it very differently when they learn about those histories. And so we do have to kind of come at those a little bit differently, just because that's our own history and our own people. So I think it can be easier to confront in some ways because they already have that Indigenous perspective, but can be harder to confront in other ways because that's our own people's experiences.
Right. How do you answer people who say, oh, my child is too sensitive? People who are not Indigenous. My child is too sensitive. She can't learn this or he can't learn that. Our children don't have a choice about these things.
Right. I tell people all the time, if my 5-year-old can experience racism, your 5-year-old can learn about it. And my kids have been experiencing racism their whole lives. I was. Starting at those young ages, and we understood it. I mean, we didn't understand why, but we understood what it was. And so, if our kids can experience those things, they don't get a choice in having this idea of an innocent childhood. The other kids, they can learn about these things too. There are ways to do it that make it understandable at young ages, that make it digestible at young ages, and
right. You don't have to honestly, tell them everything.
Right. With really young kids, I think it really leads to a lot of empathy and a lot of desire to change, desire, like I want to help fix that with younger kids. And so it's not harmful to non-native kids to learn about these things. It's really not. It's reality. And in the same ways that we can teach young kids other realities, like, there's adults out there that might want to harm you, and here's how to stay safe, right? We can teach them those realities, so then we can also teach them the realities of hard history and racism.
Right. Okay, so why do you think that it's important? You alluded to it a little bit just now in that answer, but why do you think it's important? What children are taught? Now, it seems like an obvious question, right? But how has that miseducation and that you said miseducation and undereducation, right? Mm-hmm. How have those two things contributed to what we see, to how we're living today?
Right. So a couple statistics I've already mentioned, I think at least one of them, but 40% of adults, according to a recent poll in the United States, don't know that we still exist. 87% of textbooks don't mention us past 1900, and 90% of the materials taught about us, or over 90% really, of the materials taught about us are written by non-natives. Most of what is taught is short and simplistic, and full of myths, inaccuracies, and stereotypes. The Western perspectives, Eurocentric perspectives dominate, and most of this is never corrected in college because those perspectives and issues exist in college too. You can go kindergarten through college in the United States and receive a total of 2 semesters of instruction about Native peoples, and most of it's wrong. And unless you specifically seek out Native studies in college, that's not going to get corrected.
But that seems like a lot. A total of 2? That seems like...
From kindergarten through college, though?
No. I'm saying that seems like you're being generous.
I mean, it might be generous in some places. Because really, I mean, you get a few paragraphs here and there in textbooks over the years, and
right.
Put it all together, maybe it adds up to about that much, but it's not much.
Yeah, it's not.
But the education gap on this subject leads to, ignorance, it leads to racism, it leads to violence. It directly impacts Native people and how we're treated by non-natives. It has a real world impact, from social interactions to policies and laws that affect us and harm us. Most judges in the United States don't ever learn federal Indian law at all. Federal judges don't ever learn federal Indian law. Most politicians don't ever learn federal Indian law or treaties or sovereignty. If you don't know treaties and sovereignty, you don't know U.S. history, right? And most people in the United States government never learn that. And they're the ones that are in charge of upholding those treaties, right? And they don't even ever learn about them. Most people in Congress don't even know what sovereignty means when it comes to Native nations. And so most statistics don't even include us, right? During the election, there was that something else thing, the CNN poll, something else. Yeah. So and there's this whole Native pop culture thing about being something else, and it got really funny. But that most don't even include us, right? Sometimes official paperwork and documentation doesn't even have a category for us. And so then when people are filling out paperwork, not us, but like other people about us, we'll get mischaracterized as like Latino, Black, white, or Asian, right? Depending on how some people look, right? Mm-hmm. And that also impacts any statistics as well. But, in the United States today, Native people were the most likely race to be killed by the police. There's the missing and murdered Indigenous women epidemic that a lot of people don't know about. We have some of the highest rates of sexual assault against us, where there's major health disparities and racism in healthcare against us. There's the suicide epidemics that are a direct result of what's going on, of how we're treated, of colonization, all those things. Issues of poverty and unemployment, again, direct result of colonization and ongoing genocide and how society treats us and sees us. Issues of religious rights and civil rights, which I touched on a few of those things already. But that all goes into the issues that we face. And I don't know, a lot of people don't even realize that there's actually a pipeline issue going on right now in Minnesota, Line 3, right? People are trying to get the attention that Standing Rock had, and it's not getting that attention, but that's going on right now still, and so this is all not because we're passive recipients of history, but that's all, a direct result of how we are treated by society, how we're seen by society. And that all comes from that uneducation and miseducation, and so it also causes, harmful social interactions among children. Other kids treat my kids badly because of what they've been taught about Native people, what they see in the textbooks. I had a friend when my kids were little that her kids were watching Peter Pan, and then she saw the whole the what made the red man red thing came up, and that's horribly racist. That movie is horribly racist, and her kids said something about, like, are Indians real? And she said, yeah, well, we have Native friends. And she tried to tell them about my kids and us, you're friends with Native kids. And they said, well, are they going to kill us? And she had no idea the impact that not only Peter Pan, but all these things that her kids have been seen in society and exposed to were having that kind of impact on her kids. And so she came to me frantic, like, I don't know how to correct this. I didn't even know this was happening. And that's common. Most people in the United States don't even realize that they're being confronted with negative views and stereotypes of Native people on a daily basis that are leading to kids developing all these internalized ideas about Native people that then impacts how they treat us. And so it affects how kids treat each other. My kids have been racially bullied by kids their age as early as 5 years old, So one of the major ways to combat this is through education, right? And these narratives need to be corrected and our voices need to be heard. It's vital to not only how we see history, but also to, culturally responsive education that listens to Native voices and promotes understanding and respect. And that's really important, especially for kids to start learning, because, like I said, they're confronted with all these stereotypes about Native people on a regular basis, and most people don't even realize it. And that does negatively impact us. And so, correcting this and addressing this through education is really vital to cultural understanding and respect between people as well.
Well, where do you think they get it? Like kids as young as 5, 6? You mentioned Peter Pan, but cartoons,
books, storybooks, chapter books and storybooks kids love to read that are really popular, textbooks, school curriculum, cartoons, of course, sports, the mascot issue. It's all over the place. It's really infused throughout U.S. society without people realizing it.
Yeah. Let's leave it there for now. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with educator Kelly Tudor. We will continue with this conversation in part 2, coming up in episode 7. In the meantime, check out the show notes for links to things mentioned in this interview.
Homeschool Yourself is a production of Woke Homeschooling, Inc. For show notes and links to things mentioned in the episode, visit wokehomeschooling.com/podcast. Woke Homeschooling empowers parents to teach their kids an inclusive, truthful history. We invite you to visit our website and download a sample of the history curriculum we offer for kids. Visit us at wokehomeschooling.com.